Welcome to Co-Opinions. My name is Josh, and today I have Nick with me.
Hey, Joshua.
So it's been a little while since we've recorded, I believe. So why don't I go ahead and lead with what I've been playing since we last talked. I beat Arkham Knight, which I've talked to you a bit about. I was not a fan, really, of the execution for the most part. I felt that it wasn't that fluid, but the ending was very strong, sort of. When you get through the Scarecrow part, which is the main mission, you feel real strong about it, but Batman goes, hey, I need to initiate the Nightfall protocol. And to do that, you have to beat all the side quests, which include doing almost 400 Riddler side quests.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do that. And it also included wrapping up all the... Can you imagine if to get the ending, you had to go around and do every side quest, even the ones you didn't like beat this checkpoint? And I looked it up online.
It sounds very, very unpleasant. And I think you mentioned that there is kind of a thematic reason behind why they did that at least.
And we'll get into that extensively. I'm planning on having a Rocksteady Batman episode down the line, and we'll discuss that then. I also started kind of sort of playing Yomawari Night Alone. I don't know why I keep playing these scary games. It's on the Vita. You play as a small child who, quote unquote, lost her dog, and her older sister goes to look for the dog, and there is nothing but scary Japanese spirits everywhere, and you have to run and hide or die. I don't know why I keep doing this to myself.
Are you dying a lot?
I wouldn't say I'm dying a ton, because you can usually outrun stuff, but one of the things, and this is where you would have put the game down because I've seen you play some scary games, is you have a flashlight, and some enemies you can only see when you turn your light on them. So the first time you turn it on and there's a shadow monster, it does the zoom in and the scare cord, and I'm like...
This is an isometric horror game, though, right?
Yes, so it's kind of got the Diablo top-down look to it, and it's interesting because the main character has a real chibi style, and then about 15 minutes into the game, this big shambling mass with crazy eyes and smiley teeth comes out of the street. Like, oh my god.
That makes me think of the Corpse Party Book of Shadow, where it starts off basically as a softcore lesbian porno and then immediately jumps into first person. Everything is terrible and everyone is dying. So
you got, this is a quick aside on that, you got through, the first chapter in that, and you decided, I'm not doing this?
Yes, because I asked about the isometric thing because I have a little more tolerance there because it's less immersive, but for Book of Shadows, where I'm navigating around the school in the first person, it created enough of a sense of unease that I couldn't push through that threshold. And I remembered, hey, even for the isometric, this still just was kind of a stressful thing for me to play. It did not make me feel at ease.
And that's actually another topic we're going to address at a different point, is why we play these first person, the resurgence of horror games, because there's been a push to this first person horror, but that's a topic for a different time. The stuff I'm playing right now is I started up Danganronpa 2 because I want to get through the whole series before the third one comes out in mid-September. And I've also been playing a game called Sundered by Thunder Lotus Games, the guys who did Jotun. It is a Metroidvania roguelike, which is so many buzzwords that it almost hurts, but the execution so far has been really solid. Something that I find really interesting is the objectives are always in the same place, but there can be a big empty block in between where you are in the objective. And what it does is it randomizes the order of the rooms in that big empty block each time. So it kind of gives you a this is different every time feel. It goes hand in hand with the fact that you're dealing with elder gods. Spoiler, kind of, the final boss is Nyarlathotep. So, and the tagline is resist or embrace. I'm enjoying it a lot. That being said, in the 6 hours I've put into it, it's crashed 3 times and completely frozen up once. They didn't beta it on the PS4 at all. Just because betaing stuff on PlayStation's way harder.
Now, I remember with Jotun, then that was something where it was focused on beating those bosses, those gigantic giant bosses or deity bosses, and you're this itty-bitty person. Is the boss combat kind of similar in that with Sundered? Or
Yes. So they actually have kind of expanded on that, too, because the bosses generally are enormous, and if Thunder Lotus Games is good at anything, they're amazing at creating a sense of scope. And the enemies in this, for the most part, this has been a little divisive, is every once in a while a horde of enemies will show up, and then you got to either try to take them out or run, and it can get kind of Twitch gamey, bullet hell. It's interesting, but, and this is the first time I've ever said this about a roguelike, and I think it's because you actually have a ton, it's because of the Metroidvania aspect. It's kind of easy, which is weird. I'm also playing on normal, and there's 2 harder difficulties. Honestly, I'm enjoying it now. Why would I want to change that?
When you mentioned bullet hell, it's like, let's tack on another buzzword. It makes me wonder if this was a prerequisite for them to get funding to do development, is that they had to go ahead and sell it to someone by pointing to other Steam successes.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because it did get a Kickstarter after they'd already said it was coming out on... Now, they were completely transparent about this. They said that the money from the Kickstarter is going toward the refinement of this game. So at least they have that kind of honesty going on. But the fact that they weren't able to beta it on the PlayStation has kind of hurt it a little bit. That being said, I know that you have some stuff that you've been playing before we roll into our topics for the day.
I started playing Shin Megami Tensei 4 Apocalypse, and I've cleared that out recently. That was about a 50-hour JRPG. It had a real interesting story. So the Shin Megami Tensei series is usually split upon the forces of order and law against the forces of chaos, and usually with that affiliated with that, you have different angelic figures, Michael,
Lucifer,
Michael, Metatron, Hebrew angels, basically. And then on the chaos side, then you have Lucifer and other Beelzebub, all sorts of different demons split out. With this game, then the focus on it is kind of the idea is that these polytheistic deities, Odin, Krishna, Buddha, all of these individuals feel like they have no place in Yahweh's universe. So they're trying to go ahead and destroy the universe and birth a new universe by devouring all of the souls of all the people that Yahweh has ever created to free them from the cycle of reincarnation.
Makes sense.
Spoilers for it, where the game ends up going is you basically literally kill all of the gods. So it starts off and you go ahead and you kill the Merkaba, who is kind of the highest ranking angel among the forces of order. You kill Lucifer on the chaos side. You can align with them, but that just ends the game early and gives you kind of a non-traditional bad ending if you choose to align with them. After that, you kill Odin, you kill Krishna, and then finally, after you've killed all of the polytheistic and monotheistic gods to kind of end this monotheistic-polytheistic feud, then all of a sudden people are like, well, wait a second, we can't really truly be independent unless we kill Yahweh, can we? Hey, that's right, this is Yahweh's universe. He's watching us. We can't be independent unless we kill Yahweh. So for the final boss, I went ahead and killed God. That was it. That was kind of interesting. He is all-powerful until each of the different characters renounces a kind of a doctrine of his purity, his kindness, his compassion, basically rejecting that religion, and that weakens him. So it kind of touches on that idea of belief giving God's, that common theme of belief giving God's power. Kind of interesting, but I am starting to feel a little burnt out about killing the Judeo-Christian God. This is one of the better instantiations of that I've seen, but I feel like I've done that like a dozen times in these Japanese RPGs at this point. That might be a good topic for a future episode.
Yeah, I've actually always been a little curious to examine the difference between... what was that one you played where you played as Lucifer? Was it Lucifer or Metatron? It was Shaddai?
El Shaddai, yes, Rise of the Ascension. And I believe you were playing as Metatron there, because I think the subtitle for that was Ascension of the Metatron. And Lucifer is kind of this charming, how to put it?
Is it like the Vertigo Comics version?
Well, a little bit more androgynous, I would say. So kind of androgynous, wearing an open shirt, but very, very charismatic and interesting. You fight with different angels as you're going through the game, but it's a very... there's not necessarily a coherent story.
Gotcha.
It's one of those things, if you look it up, you kind of understand what's happening, but the way you fight these different angels is odd. It's a great game. I'd recommend it to anyone listening.
All right. And what else you got on there?
After killing God, I decided I wanted something a little bit more cheerful.
Oh, right.
So I started playing Guru Men, a monstrous adventure. I am a little girl that has recently moved to a mining village, but there are no other kids around because it's a mining village. My parents are off being archaeologists somewhere, and all of a sudden I just go ahead and I find this little portal to another dimension where there's a monster town. The monsters in this universe are really smiley, happy, kind of cartoony kind of guys, and they just love having a new friend. So now the monsters are my friends, but the Phantom's attacked. So now I'm helping go ahead and rebuild the monster town, and the world is covered by dark mist. But as I make my monster friends happy, the dark mist clears, because the dark mist comes from negative emotions.
Of course it does.
It's adorable. It was developed by Nihon Falcom, the same guys who did the Ys series. These guys have a great pedigree for action RPGs and very good music. It's a masterpiece of design. This game originally came out on the Dreamcast, and I feel like if I had played this in 1990 or 2000, this would have been one of my favorite games ever. Just a lot of stuff that it was doing that was ahead of its time, and just really tight design for its time.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, with that, some of it has aged at this point because it's still got some of that late 90s 3D camera where all of a sudden you're walking through an area and you can't quite get the angle right for a jump. Recently, then I had to go ahead and just explore different areas because, so-and-so got lost on the way here for an NPC who was going to clear out and blockade for you. And I had to go ahead and explore, try and basically just find him in random places.
Yeah.
There have been a lot of little puzzles like that where there's not really any kind of guidance or hints. And I've kind of found myself going online just because after 15 or 20 minutes, I'm like, okay, this isn't really fun. Like, if there's some games where you look up the hit solution to a puzzle and you feel bad and you feel stupid, like, you know what, I shouldn't have looked this up. I should have tried harder. I could have figured this out.
Mm-hmm.
In this instance, I'm looking up this stuff and just going, why was I supposed to know that?
Yeah, that's a frustrating design feature of some of those. There was a transition point where the game design made it so you inherently knew what you were supposed to do next. And then when they transitioned to 3D, or mostly 3D in my experience, they just kind of assumed you knew what you were supposed to do. Some 2D games had this. I know with Secret of Mana, for example, they weren't always real explicit about what to do next. So it's an interesting thing watching what you could call problematic game design.
Well, I think with Secret of Mana, though, that a lot of times then you would get some sort of skill set that would let you explore a new area. So, like, if you go back to the game before that with Sword of Mana or Final Fantasy Adventure, then you have that. It's like you got a new weapon in a dungeon, so now there's new areas on your world map you can go back to and kind of clear out. So I think it kind of worked in that 2D sense, but without that kind of impetuous of, well, hey, here's this new area you know you should go to, and where it's just, we'll go back here and talk to some NPC. I know, especially for RPGs, though, that is just a common thing they've tended to do, too, is we'll just wander around and talk to everyone again.
Yeah.
And you get kind of tired of that after the first or second pass where it turns out, well, you just missed one NPC that you forgot to check in on.
Yeah, looking at you, Final Fantasy VIII. But neither here nor there. I do understand that there was a game that you decided enough was enough.
That is correct. So I went ahead and I started Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep recently. Played through most of Terra's Story. I got near the end of that. And finally, I just decided, this is stupid. This game sucks.
So we're going to take that opportunity to transition to our first topic of the evening. And that is going to be games that we decided to quit playing. Nick, why don't you kick it off with your Birth by Sleep?
Sure. So the main reason I decided to quit playing Birth by Sleep is I found myself forcing myself to play the game. I'd look at what I could do with the evening, and I'd think about what games to play, and I'd say, well, I could do Birth by Sleep. Well, I don't really want to. We'll just go ahead and do it. And I'd make some progress, but I can't say I ever really had much in the way of fun. It's the same super simplistic kind of action RPG combat that's been in the Kingdom Hearts series for a long time, coupled with kind of a dumb or needlessly complex method of improving your skills and kind of fusing them together. It kind of ties back, I think, to that Crisis Core comic by Penny Arcade where you're just shoving materials together and all of a sudden you have Cheesy Gordita Ranch, Gravity, Ice, Blizzaga.
Yeah, there was... And I know not fun is one of the reasons, because I have a list of games myself, and some of those, like, for example, NBA Jam, you were expected the quote-unquote campaign was you had to play a series of 2-on-2, and there was like 75 of these games you had to... It's an arcade game. And I never officially beat it, because to beat it, I would have had to sink about 35 hours of repetition. It's just unenjoyable.
That's a game that's not meant to be played in that kind of a long burst like that. Just like you said, that's meant to be, I got 15, 20 minutes to kill. I want to goof off with a friend. Hey, let's just throw this on and have a little bit of fun with this game.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of grindy nature kind of carried over to a couple other games. Like, for example, you beat FF3. I got up to the Crystal Tower. Like, how much longer can this take? And you go, it's been about 15, 20 hours grinding up for the final boss.
I was pretty overpowered for Cloud of Darkness by the time I got to that point, but that was a definite area where you had a difficulty spike that, in my view, required grinding. If I were a better gamer, then who knows, maybe I could have figured that out.
We should ask Chris.
Yes. Chris, go ahead and tell us what we're doing wrong here, just like with the Adamantoise fight.
About to say, tell us how to min-max our characters so we can beat it at level 5.
I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek, but he probably is the guy, if I got stuck on a JRPG, I'd probably be like, hey, Chris, so what was your party build like when you got to this area?
Yeah, pretty much. What other games did you have that you dropped? I listed mine out by not fun and too difficult to be fun. And that's recognizing that some games are made for difficulty, like Bloodborne, Dark Souls, Super Meat Boy. That's not what I felt these other games had an example. So why don't you go ahead and give a couple more examples?
I did want to go ahead and give one last complaint about Birth by Sleep, is that I'm really fed up with the Kingdom Hearts method of storytelling. All hearts are lost in the darkness. What does that mean? They just throw these words together, and I understand that each of these words individually has like a metaphor to it or a literal interpretation that might be tied to it, but these guys will go ahead and spit out like 3 or 4 sentences in a row about light, darkness, love, good, anger, hate, and it feels like I'm just looking at one of those little fuzzy emotion diagrams with where it's trying to teach kids about facial expressions like, I am happy, I am sad, I am glum, I am hungry.
Do you remember in one of the earlier Kingdom Hearts games where Sora manually made himself smile?
Yes.
I'm about to say, you're bringing back. Now, I'm going to play Kingdom Hearts 3. There's no doubt in my mind. But I got to say, 3D did a pretty good job of killing my enthusiasm for that game. Anyways.
With other games that I've disliked, that I've quit. So, as I mentioned, that's one where I didn't really feel like narratively there was much of a payoff, and I just wasn't having much fun for it. One of the other kind of reasons that I've quit games, like you said, is where you just kind of feel like it's not really... have you ever quit a game because you don't feel like the controls are good? Like, you like what it's doing from a overall story perspective, but the controls just aren't tight enough for you?
The closest one I could come to in that regard was I dropped Dead Rising, and that's because it was a 2006 launch 360 game, and on top of that, I watched Aaron mostly beat that game. So when I started playing it, and my guy was slow, and he kept getting eaten, and he played like you would imagine somebody in a zombie apocalypse would. Now, I know when he maxes out his level, he becomes just an absolute world ender, but I didn't want to sink the 20 hours necessary to get him, so at the beginning, the controls are absolute garbage, but that is where I can relate. What example were you going to give on that?
Mine on that was Sonic and the Secret Rings for the Wii. That was a game that had it had really great music, really imaginative environments and Sonic's running through, kind of fun gameplay where it's very tightly linear in a 3D fashion, but you have, with that speed, you have stuff that you can miss, and part of that thrill, of course, is collecting like the red rings for the secret, and going back and being like, oh man, I almost got that one. I should replay that stage. I think I can time that jump just right with just the right momentum to grab that ring. It was a game that it really made me sad, because I feel like if I could have played that game with normal controls, that would have been a very amazing Sonic game, and one I would have had a lot of fun with. But it required the Wiimote's little tilt control, so you had to tilt Sonic to give him momentum.
No.
That didn't work so hot for me. So that's one I had to put down for bad controls. Birth by Sleep was kind of an all-around failure. One game that I quit as a kid that I did go back and play, you mentioned Final Fantasy VIII earlier. That was one I quit as a kid, and I've kind of found it's unfortunate. Do you ever find yourself like binging on a game and you're having a great time, but then you get to the end and you're kind of starting to get tired of it, so you're just trying to push through?
That is the worst feeling, because I know for Batman, that's why I decided to bail on it, because despite what the negative things I'm going to say are, I actually enjoyed it for the most part. And then at the end, where it's like, well, if you want the real ending, do all this stuff you intentionally skipped. No.
I experienced that with The Godfather, not for the real ending, but kind of like, hey, here's the extra ending. And that I did the exact same thing as you did there. Well, I could play this game for another 20 to 30 hours, or I can go on YouTube.
Yeah, pretty much. But back to...
Final Fantasy VIII was an example of a game where I didn't want to, where I kind of burnt out on, and I was feeling a little bad of that with Shin Megami Tensei 4 Apocalypse, where you play so much of a game in a short chunk that you need to instead just step away from it. But in your mind, you're like, well, I'm so close to the end, it can't be that much longer. And it always is a little bit longer.
That's what kind of definitely killed Kingdom Hearts 3D for me, was I was at the very end. I'm like, I only have these bosses left. If I put this down, I'm not going to pick it back up. And the bosses were garbage.
There were like 6 bosses, yeah.
Oh my god.
The different time-looped xenohorts, and then just the random black-robed guy who was thrown in there just for the heck of it.
Yeah, like evil, whatever.
Well, I love the end. So going back to Final Fantasy VIII, I loved it when I played it again several years later and wound up beating it. And like that portion where I got frustrated as a kid, and I realized it was just, hey, you were playing this during summer vacation, you were 14, and you had been playing this week after week after week, and you were just kind of done with that.
Where did you get frustrated? Because I know at the very end when there's time compression, like it entirely shifts the flow of the game.
Yep.
Is that where?
Yeah, I was actually in Ultimisia's castle, and I found myself frustrated with the whole, well, you have to go ahead and recover all of your different
That
things.
sucked.
That
was
was annoying.
not a fan of that.
The other game I had made a note of that I quit, and this is where you have games where the pacing is just bad on them, was Harvest Moon: A New Beginning. I loved Harvest Moon whenever I was a kid. I put a lot of time into Harvest Moon 64, and I still feel like that's the best example of a well-paced one because you can kind of see and do most of everything in that game in about like a 30 hour period. You can get through several seasons, your character can get married, you win the horse races, you see the different little festival scenes, and it's just a fun, relaxing game. For Harvest Moon: A New Beginning, then in general, after Harvest Moon 64, they started adding more and more complexity to it with what you could explore, what you could do, the things you could level up. And I feel like that padded the game length unnecessarily. So for Harvest Moon: A New Beginning, I think I put a good 30 or 40 hours into that. I was only at the end of season 1.
Oh.
Yes, I was just starting my second sprig, and I kind of realized, hey, I'm going to have to put like 120, 160 hours into this game to kind of experience everything like I did in Harvest Moon 64. And it's like, well, why am I playing this? Why don't I just play Harvest Moon 64?
And on the pacing note, one of the ones that I put down, I'm not sure if this counts as pacing or it's one of those going back to an early game thing. I got Metroid 2, the Game Boy version, on the 3DS Virtual Console. Early Game Boy games, actually not even, I'm going to go with early, because I think it came out in like 91. We've been spoiled nowadays. We got our maps, we think you should go in this direction. Metroid 2 said you have to kill this many Metroids to get to the next level. Well, where are they? What direction are they in? I don't know. Where are the Chozo statues? Nah. And I'm thinking, I should beat it. This is the only Metroid game I haven't beaten. So I put it down to wait for the motivation. And then at this last E3, they're like, hey, we're remaking it and it's going to be much better. Yes! Goodbye forever, Metroid 2.
That makes me think about some of those older RPGs where you have to go ahead and do the pen and paper grid map to find your way. Oh. And it's a subject of a lot of argument among fans of those games, whether Automapper is good or bad. I am firmly on the position that it's good. You can most games let you turn it off if you don't want to make use of it, but there's certain tasks that just aren't fun to people for playing a game. And for myself, then drawing a map like that, which I think is what you basically have to do to play Metroid 2.
Pretty much.
That's not enjoyable.
Not at all. But did you have any more games that you dropped?
I didn't have any others listed. I did have one on your list I thought would be interesting to touch on because it also kind of ties into one of mine, if I may mow your grass. It's Type 0.
Oh, yeah. So I'm gonna bring that up real quick because my shortest version is it wasn't really fun. I thought it was going to be more enjoyable. And they had so many characters, I could not get invested in any of them. I really still didn't care about what was going on. I don't know if it was a mixture of I had other stuff I wanted to play more mixed with the fact that you and everybody else said, it's not really going to get better. And then when I looked up the ending, spoilers, if for some reason you're going to play through Type 0, you're in a time loop that's been going for like 2 billion iterations. Like, oh, I'm so glad I didn't beat this.
We went peak Toriyama, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, man. But anyways.
Well, I think that game was an example where you have a portable game that gets brought to a modern console, and there's certain design decisions that were made in place there for it to be a little bit more portable, and they can feel a little bit odd to you. Like, that was something I noticed with Birth by Sleep, and it wasn't a bad thing, but just the worlds themselves all felt short. Part of that was they split the story into 3 different characters where you're playing through those same worlds. And part of that was they wanted to be, well, you just play it for a short period and you clear that world. But with that, then I didn't feel like you were really exploring those Disney worlds or exploring anything of note like you might in Kingdom Hearts 2. So that's where it kind of loosened that narrative, that narrative appeal of having some sort of coherent reason for the story. But with it's something where they made that decision because it was originally on a portable system.
And when I played through Birth by Sleep the first time, because I did play through it more than once, it was on the PSP, and I saw that exact thing that you were talking about. I'm like, wow, this level's already over. And it felt kind of refreshing on the PSP because that's what you wanted, was something you could be like, and now I turn this off. But I always thought it would control so much better on a console. Then when I played through it on PS3, all I could think of, this is actually maybe better on the PSP, which is something I don't think many people have ever said. I had a few more examples myself. One that I put down, and I'm not sorry about it at all, is Patapon 3. Love the first Patapon. In fact, I might buy the remastered version that came out just because that game was super fun. The second game came out, and it went from a army of... So Patapon, what you do is you control a little army of eyeball monsters, and you use the 4 face buttons to issue them commands, and it's all rhythm-based. I thought it was a really clever idea. In the second one, they put a lot of emphasis on your one hero unit, which kind of takes away from the whole you have an army you're controlling, because you can just have your hero unit use their OP ability, and they can never get hurt. And then in the third game, you only controlled 4 people. It kept going away from the idea to the point by the time I got to the fourth one that this doesn't even feel like the same Patapon anymore. So I put it down completely shamelessly at that point. And there were a couple games where I felt like the difficulty to fun ratio didn't qualify me to finish playing it. One of them was the remake of Chronicles of Riddick, because I beat it on the Xbox, and you could tell that it was a game that was designed 5 years before it was re-released, because some of the design decisions, they just weren't the most clever, and I wasn't feeling it the second time through, which I can't say I've encountered that in any other games. I bought quite a few remasters since then. So I really wanted to get through it because I thought I really liked it, and I can see why I would like it, but it didn't have the same magic the same time through, and I couldn't tell you why. But the last one on here, did you ever play Final Fantasy, the Crystal Chronicles, on GameCube?
I did not. I did not have the multiple controllers and friends who were interested in that series, etc.
Well, neither did I, which is what caused me to stop playing it, was because the idea was you have to fill up your Crystal Chalice by beating 3 levels that have these trees in them, and then every year the enemies get harder. And I kind of put myself into a corner because I got up to like year 10 and bosses were killing me in one shot. Oof. And since I didn't have any friends, I couldn't be like, quick guys, heal me, because there were no friends to play with. So I got to the end of the game, and you need multiple people to play that game. It is unfun and unreasonable to do it by yourself.
That makes me think of Peace Walker, where it was originally set up with a lot of like online multiplayer stuff, and they still had that for Metal Gear Solid HD. But personally, when I played it, I couldn't actually get anyone to go ahead and join in the boss fights. So the boss fights just were very, very long, with you kind of chipping away at an enemy's health, like if you're trying to go ahead and sharpen a pencil with your fingernails.
It's like the worst parts of those Castlevania games where you have to chip away at the boss, but it's not really fun in the process.
It was the second worst thing about the game, because the first worst thing was having a villain named Hot Cold Man.
Oh,
you look glad sad, man.
Oh, man. I'm having flashbacks to our Metal Gear Solid series. Oh, man.
Shoutouts to Brent.
Shoutouts, homie. Anyways, this last one I have on here, I know I'd mentioned that Crystal Chronicles was the final one, but this last one will serve as a good bridge between this topic and the next one. Are there any games that you had to put down just because it's an interesting situation? Because I bought a couple games during a very difficult point in my life, Rogue Legacy and Ali Ali. I needed games that were pretty much mindless because I needed to turn my brain off at that point. And I enjoyed both of them tremendously, but they are always associated with a very painful time in my life. So they announced Ali Ali 2 was coming out, and I'm like, I'm going to pick up this game. And I picked it up. I'm like, I can't play this without thinking of a terrible time in my life. So luckily, it was a PS Plus game, so I was able to put it down, no harm, no foul. But that was a game that inadvertently made me really bummed out. That was by no means the intention, but there are many a game where the intention is to evoke strong emotion in you, and the one we're going to talk about today is games that intentionally try to make you sad. And feel good hit of the summer right here, right?
Yeah, let's talk about our crippling issues with depression.
Ooh, one that I want to bring up in passing, and I'm not going to give the spoilers because I know you, Nick, are very excited to play. Ori and the Blind Forest has 2 of the saddest scenes in gaming in my mind, and they open with one of them.
Ooh.
Oh, it's brutal. And about halfway through it, there's another one. Don't watch the trailer for the sequel, because it kind of gives away some major plot stuff for the first one. But Ori and the Blind Forest would 100% recommend it. Be prepared for the sad feels, though. A couple other games that I want to mention just by myself, because we have a list of ones that we're going to discuss as well. The ending of Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. Now, you're never going to play through this, right? It's a PSP game from like a decade ago at this point.
Never, ever.
So, one of the things that was interesting about Crisis Core was the fact you played as Zack, who was alluded to strongly in Final Fantasy VII. And you kind of wonder, as you're building up this character, how in the world he's going to get killed by 3 Shinra soldiers at the end of the game, because the second to last boss is a person with the powers of the goddess of that world. How is 3 guys going to kill you? So you've been building up these relationships and creating strong bonds, and what you do whenever you do your limit break is it comes into a slot machine. And whoever's face pulls up on that slot machine, it shows a short cinematic of an emotional time you had with them, and then you get superpowered. As you're going right into Midgar, you're jumped by the entirety of the Shinra army. Like 1 million people show up.
Interestingly, this is what happens when you just decide to invade a hostile city's headquarters, is that all of their army comes out to fight you.
Who would have thunk it? But anyways, it sets it up real bad for this is a loser battle. Because it starts playing at the Price of Freedom, I believe, which is one of the saddest songs in the world. And as endless enemies are coming to attack you and your health keeps chipping off, it brings up your limit break. And as you bring up your limit break, it shows like your mentor, and then the picture starts to fade out. And then when it brings back up the limit break, his picture has been whited out. It goes through every character you interact with to the point where the final time you use it, it kind of cuts away as you go into a cinematic. And then when it cuts out from the cinematic, there's only 3 Shinra soldiers left and you can't lift your sword. It brings up your limit break thing, and you had been romancing Eris at this point. And your limit break thing is almost broken. Like there's cracks in it. Some of the wheels aren't turning. And it brings up Eris as the very last one. And it kind of fades out. And they take a shot at you. And oh my God, it's such a bummer.
I feel sad now.
That was kind of the point. And I wanted to die. Not actually, but
it's that sinking pit in your stomach. Yeah.
If you want, and this is a mild shout out, I don't know, I hope you check it out. Banjo Guy Ali did a fantastic cover of the Price of Freedom. It really captures how much of a downer that moment is. They really nailed the feeling. I didn't know how they would make me care about this character, and by the end of Crisis Core, I really did care about him, and it made me incredibly sad when he passed, even though I knew that's what's going to happen.
I think that's one of the frustrating things with Final Fantasy as a franchise, is that they can be so spotty on when they succeed in making you really feel that kind of empathy for the characters. And other times you might expect to have that empathy and you don't. You think the character's stupid and you're glad when bad things happen to them.
Looking at you, FF5 or Vaughn. Yeah, Galuf died. I don't care.
Vaughn's entire family could die and just be like, shh, let both of you talk.
Yeah, we don't really want to hear from you.
He's got a very clever quip about the death of your family. Now let's just hear him talk.
And let's see what his pithy rabbit female has to say about it. Good old Fran. The other one, we'll talk about this. I'll bring it up only briefly. The Last of Us opened with an incredibly powerful scene. At this point, it's not a recent game, so I can give it. Your daughter gets shot in front of you and she dies in your arms, and that's a bummer. And it kind of only gets worse, because at that point, your main character is so hardened by everything he had to deal with after this that he does not want to let this other character get close to him. And by the end, he's let her get close. And they go, hey, thanks for bringing her all the way out here, spending, 12, 15 hours in this game, bringing her out here. To save the world, we have to kill her. What? And you have to kind of screw the world to save this person who is now your daughter's surrogate. And I'm really curious to see where The Last of Us 2 goes with this. Because is Joel even in it? I don't know.
Well, I think he is because we saw him in that trailer. But
I haven't actually watched that trailer.
I didn't think it was that good of a trailer. Honestly, it didn't get me excited. Basically, instead of your surrogate daughter, your surrogate daughter has grown older. She's got a tattoo. She's angrily strumming an acoustic guitar and kind of plotting revenge. I feel like they're basically kind of building up a traumatic backstory for her, and I'm not really. I'm concerned about their ability to do that properly. I should have some faith because with Naughty Dog, they've shown they have a good ability to do that. But I could easily see this being kind of too heavy-handed and obvious.
Yeah, we'll see how that pans out. Honorable mention goes to the PS Vita game. I believe it's also on PC called Actual Sunlight. This gets a half and half for me because it deals with a guy who is quote unquote stuck in a middle class job and he tries to make himself feel better with material purchases. It's a bummer, but it's also one of those things where I didn't like the guy.
People in Venezuela are currently soldiers in Venezuela are currently being rewarded for their loyalty with toilet paper. Right. You're loyal to the regime, so you get toilet paper. Supermarkets are empty. And meanwhile, we have this poor guy with his middle-class life who just feels a little bit of a pit in his stomach. Well, he's got food, he's got shelter, but he doesn't feel self-actualized.
What killed me about it was, and don't read too much into this, anybody listening to it, is I know I've dealt with the point where I felt like I wasn't good enough. I felt like I was just trying to materially fill what I was doing, and it makes me angry because this guy, he's like, I'm trying to be nice to these coworkers, this female coworker, but she doesn't reciprocate my feelings I've never actually said. And when you do say them near the end of the game, she goes, I've been here for 7 years and you've watched me develop in a relationship with another person. This is only on you for not moving on. And he just fails to, the developer even says this in the game, do not take this as a how-to guide. He explicitly says that. Because at the end of the game, this guy who completely failed at trying to get over his problems, to try to deal with them healthy, the only thing you can do is throw yourself off of the building at the end. I hated how he addressed this problem. I thought it did good in creating a dialogue, and I'm sure it bummed some people out. But to me, this was basically how not to deal with depression 101. And it's not even a situation of you need to, find a constructive way. I'm not even saying buck up and get over it. He didn't try to address it. Like, he has a narrative going on in his head where he's talking to his psychiatrist, and then it turns out he doesn't have a psychiatrist. He's just fabricated these interactions to make himself feel better. Go to a psychiatrist. If you feel bad, people, talk to somebody.
Well, and I think with that, it's with what you said there, where the developer had intended this to be basically a warning to other people. Don't treat this as a to-do. It's kind of almost like It's a Wonderful Life, where it's painting kind of a picture of, well, if you make kind of a terrible decision, or if you really get what you want, where you just no longer exist or whatever, this is the outcome of things. This is painting you can just go ahead and do nothing, not try and solve any of your problems, but this is kind of how that ends if you do.
Mm-hmm. Anyways,
try not to fall on anyone as you fall off the skyscraper.
He was a big dude, too. He could have done some damage. On the other side, he could have probably had a most amazing, Rorschach test when he hit the ground. What do you see? A failed life. Anyways, I also have a list of some games that we've both played that elicited big sads. But before we get on to that, why don't you run down your specific examples of games you've played that bummed you out?
Well, a lot of those games that you just talked about were ones that were focused kind of on loss or death, and I think that's a big part of why we play a lot of these kind of games, is because it's a way of letting us either cope with a trauma that's happened in our life or a fear that we have. Especially the death of a loved one is something that a lot of us have either dealt with or have that fear of doing, where we have someone that's so important to us, and we know, a father or a mother, where we know we're going to have to say goodbye to them at some point, and how much that will hurt. That's part of why in Red Dead Redemption, then that whole scene in the finale hurt people so much. One other aspect of sad games that I thought I would touch on, though, is kind of more of those bittersweet games where it's almost more nostalgic. And that can be handled in different ways. Two games that came to mind for me on that were Earthbound and then Attack of the Friday Monsters. For Attack of the Friday Monsters, that was one of the level 5 kind of indie-ish games called from their guild effort that they released on the Nintendo eShop. And it was a pretty basic, almost more of a graphic adventure kind of thing without really any puzzles and just kind of talking with people, almost a visual novel. But it just kind of showed that innocence of childhood in such a way, but with kind of backdrops of fear to it as well, like references to pollution, that threat of kind of alien invaders. If you kind of read into it a little bit, you can kind of see it being set in that post-war period after Japan had just gotten the hell nuked out of it. You have these issues of pollution and these fears of what nuclear radiation might do, and you can kind of see that fear aspect to it, and also but that desire to return back to that time. I think that's also a lot of the power of period pieces and nostalgia for us, is we want to go back to it. It's the Paradise Lost basic idea, where we have that knowledge that it wasn't actually a paradise and we can't go back and that we shouldn't go back to it, but we have that longing to return home, I guess, as it were. And I think you see a lot of that with some of Earthbound's imagery as you go ahead and you hit those different special spots. You have those flashbacks to kind of childhood, and then at the end where you're literally kind of going back to this evil being birthed. There's a lot of focus there on kind of that sense of innocence is a lot of times tied to kind of like going back to those childhood things. And even just playing that game as kind of an 8 or a 9-year-old, I found myself feeling nostalgic about being like 4 or 5.
The good old days.
Well, it wasn't even like the things weren't were bad as an 8 and 9-year-old. It's just it kind of made me miss different things. Like it made you start thinking about those very, very early first memories you have. And I think about like watching Donald Duck cartoons and eating applesauce and being about to go to preschool and just memories like that. So I really would love to, because I feel like you have a lot of games that focus on sadness as kind of a death thing. I would like to see more games kind of try and focus on that melancholy or nostalgia or just that longing to go home, I guess.
Well, and I'd like to speak to both of those points is because one of the strengths, and it's a real difficult thing to sell to people, one of the strengths of Kentucky Route Zero is I think it really nails that melancholy. You haven't played Act 4 yet, right?
I have not.
Near the end of it, the inevitability of this is how life is. Like there's a point where, because at the end of Act 3, the protagonist had agreed to work for this company of glowing skeletons, essentially. And there was a weird, dreadful inevitability where he's like, at some point, you got to work for these guys because you made a deal you weren't aware of. And that's just how life is. But Kara, actually, my girlfriend, recently asked me, because I skipped over one of the games that bummed me out was MGS5 at the end, because I had spent, spoiler for MGS5, even though you've probably listened to the MGS series at this point, at the end of the game, you lose Quiet. And this bummed me out tremendously because I had been using her. It wasn't even that she developed in the story tremendously, because she did. There were some things, but I used her so much that I want to say I had her in like 30% of the game. And then when you lose her, it's the only time you hear her speak in the game. And she's like, I've always respected you and you meant the world to me. And because of that, you're never going to see me again. Like, I want to die right now. And Kara goes, why do you play these games that make you sad? And you were right. The most ones that deal with it are the ones that involve loss. And I go, I play them because they're relatable. It's not necessarily that I enjoy being sad. I don't think a lot of people enjoy being sad. But this is a level of universal, quote unquote, empathy that's really nice to have, because there are certain times that you're dealing with things that you really don't like dealing with. Like you said, you could have lost a loved one, or maybe you lost something else that was important to you. Almost everybody goes through this. So when you play these games where maybe you lose them through a violent mean, which is incredibly unfortunate, maybe you lose them through something that's as middle of the road as a terminal disease. There was a PC game recently called like Rakuin or something. It has to do with a kid with a terminal disease. Like, they brought up the point, is this pandering or is this trying to, again, connect with people who have lost in this significant of a way? I like to think it's the latter, because we all encounter this, and it's really unfortunate. Anyways, were there any other game? Oh, I remember what it was now. So it's not even nostalgia. It is being able to relate to things other than loss. And I'm going to do a quick aside here because this isn't a game, but there's a movie called Babadook. And it sells itself as a horror thriller, but what it actually is a person who is dealing with the loss of a loved one, but they're dealing with it in the monster is a manifestation of how they're dealing with depression. And I love this because it very strongly spoke to a specific period of my life. But a lot of people were like, what's going, I don't understand this. And that's why I think more things deal with loss than other specific emotions that are associated with sadness, like nostalgia, or sometimes you just find yourself being unable to relate to other people, alienation. It's not as universal of a truth.
Well, I think that's where if you have sad games that may not be sad to you, they still can be valuable because they can kind of help you empathize with another person's position. So The Vanishing of Ethan Carter kind of comes to mind to me for an indie game in that regard. So you're encountering all these fantastical things as you go through the game. And kind of the big twist that you encounter at the ending is all of these things are basically just the imaginations of this young kid who was kind of writing these little amateur detective novels for himself. And that kid died in a house fire. Yeah. It was a sad game, but it didn't really do much for me from a sadness perspective. I didn't really feel that sinking pit in my stomach. But can you imagine playing that game if you had lost a young child? You had an 8 or a 9-year-old and they died in a car accident, and you kind of thought about those snuffed possibilities that weren't ever realized. Just because there's certain things that everyone will have to deal with, like the loss of a father. But it's one of those things that you certainly hope most people don't have to deal with the death of their child. The only thing worse than a child losing their parent is a parent having to put their own child into the ground.
Fully aware. On that note, we're going to transition to the games that we've played together. Not together necessarily, but we both played so we can both speak to how they affected us. One of the games that has been relatively divisive over the last few years is a game called Undertale. The reason I really believe it's divisive is because it has such a passionate fan base, and I believe a large part of that fan base is a younger audience who thinks that this is speaking to certain emotions they haven't been able to recognize in a way that they can relate to. Now, what really makes it sad, there's two things to me that make it sad. And the first one is the fact that you build a lot of connections with a lot of characters over the course of this game. And it's a game that prides itself on you don't have to hurt anybody through the whole game. So it gets sad at the very end because, one, even from a meta level, these are characters at the end explicitly say, thank you so much for everything, we'll never forget you. And then the game calls out the fact that you're never going to see these people again, which it's kind of got the melancholy, you're growing up. And there's even the antagonist of the game. You find out he's not a bad guy, he just got put in a bad situation. And he goes, thanks so much for everything, please don't forget me. I can never leave, but I won't forget you. Like, Jesus Christ. So I think that speaks to one of the things you were saying about a different way to evoke sad, because I don't think you did it and I didn't do it, but I explicitly told Brent when he beat it, when you beat the final boss, go back to the very beginning part of the game, because you can speak to the child version of the final boss. And I don't know if you looked that up online, but it gets you in the feels. And I know you were kind of not super on board with Undertale when it first came out because of the hype train. I'm glad you played through it. I'm glad I bought it for you so you'd play through it.
It was an excellent game, no regrets.
And I'm probably going to play it again when it comes out on PlayStation because I'd just like to support that particular creator. Did you have any thoughts on that particular sad aspect of it?
Nope.
The other sad part was the other thing you can do in that game. It's called a genocide run. You can kill everybody. And this is sad for a totally different reason, because most people will have played through the main game first without hurting anybody. At least that's what I saw. And then these people that you felt such a strong connection with, you're mowing down in one hit. And the one that really made me recognize how monstrous it was going to be was when you fight Sans, who is spoiler, when you fight Papyrus the only time, he goes, you seem like a bad person, but I think everybody can be a better person. He doesn't fight you. He goes, if you choose to run, he gives you a hug, and then you've ruined your genocide run. But if you kill him, he goes, I guess I was wrong, and then he dies. And it's such a bummer. By the time you get past the third major boss, because I forgot you fight Goat Mom, who, when you kill her, she goes, "You're just as bad as the monsters." When you fight the third major boss, who is the only thing, she goes, "I'm the only thing standing between you and the end of the world." You just mow through everything till the end of the game, at which point you fight the dumpy little skeleton man who will wreck you. And when you defeat him, he goes, "Well, this is how the world ends, I suppose." It's a bummer because they so effectively exploit the connections you've made. It was a really good game, and I wish I could sell this to people in a way that they go, "That's that thing from Tumblr, right?" Right? But we're going to transition on to two other games we played, one briefly and one a little longer. One, it was an indie game from 2015, I believe, called Papers, Please. And the concept behind it is you're a border patrol person between Arstatska and some other... Kalecha? Yeah.
The victim of the Great Vowel Famine of 1991.
Ooh. And it has these... Nick had brought this up before we were talking about it. He goes, "Well, what kind of a sad is that?" It's a nihilistic sad, because you are paid based on how many people you process, but sometimes the people you process, early on in the game, there's a couple, and the husband goes through no problem, but the wife doesn't have the proper documentation. She tells you if she doesn't make it through, she's not sure she'll ever be able to make it through. But if you pass her through, you could get a deduction that means you can't pay for your family to have food or heat, which could result in you losing your family. And meanwhile, they keep stepping up the difficulty. You have to look through more documentation. You have to start watching for terrorists. And meanwhile, you still have to support your family and take care of them. It's really grim and dark, and brought even more to light by the minimalistic style. I know you played through it, but you played through with the easy modifier on, didn't you? And I don't blame you in the slightest, because I was getting an anxiety attack playing through it in the normal, but I really enjoyed it because of that, because this was grimness that I was entirely unfamiliar with, because why would we be familiar with that?
It's an effective totalitarian socialist communist regime simulator.
Oh, it was dark. But speaking of dark, and speaking of though this does not explicitly reference anything in history because all those countries were made up, right? I'm not fully familiar with my Middle East.
None of those are any of the Eastern European Soviet bloc.
And not even from 30 years ago.
Nope.
The last one that got me in a real interesting way, and when Nick heard about this, he was fully on board, is a game called Valiant Hearts of the Great War.
Yep.
It was a puzzle game by Ubisoft set in World War I. Now, Nick, I'm going to let you take over for this because you are huge into history.
Yeah, so World War I is one of those periods of history that gets overlooked by a lot of people because World War II was essentially the same tragedy on a much larger scale, and it's really unfortunate with that because of the level of sacrifice. Once again, with World War I, you have tens of millions of people dying, and basically what you had with that was a society that had learned a lot of new and advanced ways to kill each other very, very efficiently, and a civilian populace as well as an elite establishment structure in these societies that was not really prepared for the cost. That gets into how you had people that believed that this would be a simple war, it would be over very quickly. People were used to fighting with 19th century technology and with 19th century conflicts, which were not nearly as brutal and horrific as 20th century machines allowed us to kill each other.
They show, one of the things that jumped out at me, they not only do they show in the game, now it's all cartoonish, but it doesn't take away from the gravity of it. They show the effects of machine guns in warfare, trench warfare, and mustard gas. One of the things they do exceedingly well is using historical artifacts to bring to light how truly horrific it was. You find a gas mask of sorts, and it goes, this mask was often soaked in urine because they found that the urine bound with the mustard gas in such a way that it would all crystallize on the face mask, which was incredibly disgusting for the soldiers, but it kept them from dying. So I think that was a perfect example of where games can be a teacher. And from a sadness perspective, I think that was a great example of a game illustrating where real people in the recent past
were thrown into a terrible situation by forces outside their control. Mm-hmm. And as you play through the individuals in this game, you see them trying to make the best of that situation with a very tragic ending for one of them.
Because, correct me if I'm wrong, off the top of my head, I remember you play as a American who... for people like you and I, it's completely different perspective because it is a black soldier in France, and it's the early 20th century, so he is being discriminated against because he is different, and the French guy you play as allies with him because he recognizes, hey, we're technically fighting on the same side. There's no reason that we should be bad to you because you look different. So that right there, when you're playing as the American, you have to deal with all these prejudices that someone like Nick or I are completely unfamiliar with. When you're dealing with the French guy, who is for the most part the main character, he is old enough that he was enjoying a farm living before this. He got thrust into this battle completely unwilling for the most part, if I'm remembering right.
By enjoying a farm living, what we mean there is working 80 hours a day to get his crops in so that he could feed his family and supply a modest living. It wasn't an easy life.
It wasn't an easy life, but it wasn't also having to worry about your feet swelling up to the size of watermelons.
Comparatively, yeah.
Right. And then there was also the civilian you played as, I think.
I believe she was a photographer or a journalist for a newspaper.
Was there a medic too?
I think she volunteered as a nurse.
Okay. And that showed the civilian point of view on this because I believe, and I could be getting things mixed up, I believe she might have been the daughter of the French guy, and she had a romantic relationship with a German soldier. Yep. But then they went to war, and they could not be together because of this reason. So you saw how basic relationships were torn apart by the war. You saw how families were split apart by the war. You saw how people from other countries were affected by the war. And one of the most, and again, this is at your own perspective, the game essentially ends, and I'm probably going to mess this up. What is the battle? The
Battle of Verdun.
It was Verdun. So, Nick, why don't you give some historical context for people who don't know what the Battle of Verdun is?
The French are often criticized as being pacifistic, but if you look at their history in World War I and World War II and the amount of blood that they spilled, the amount of young men that went away never to come back, with Verdun being a great example where hundreds of thousands of French men lost their lives, then you understand why exactly a culture might be considered a little bit more war-averse than other cultures on the other side of the pond. Specifically with Verdun, then you had shelling, killing soldiers in such a degree that you had literal pools of blood that soldiers were being forced to wade through to go ahead and charge machine gun emplantments.
And this battle, I know correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm going to defer to you on all history here, but it became so bloody that there began to be not insubordination, because that's not violent. What's the violent?
Full-on mutiny.
Full-on mutiny. And that's what ends up happening with your main French character, is that he, I think he kills his commanding officer, because the commanding officer keeps sending people out to essentially die on top of the people they just sent out.
Yep.
So he ends up offing his commanding officer, and the game ends. Spoiler, I guess, but my God. The game ends, and I looked this up. This did not happen to a lot of people. I think it happened to less than 2 dozen. You end up being tried and executed for your treat. Is it considered treason to kill your commanding officer?
I do not know this. I do not know on that note.
Whatever it was, you end up being tried. You get led out to a firing squad, and the game cuts away as they all raise their rifles at you. And then the historical blurb comes up. This many people died in Verdun. This many people committed open mutiny. This many were executed for committing said mutiny.
And it's worth noting that this was just a death. These deaths were also just military deaths. When you look at the amount of civilian deaths, some of them through diseases and through famine and other things that may have been preventable had resources been available to help take better care of them. And this was just on the Western Front. If you start looking into the Eastern Front with the Habsburg Empire's invasion of Serbia, you start talking about a country that lost literally a third of its young men aged from around age 18 to 40. A third of a country's men being murdered in war. So, all right, deep breath.
All right. So,
this is why we play these sad games.
We
do. Because there's things that we can't really fully grasp unless we can go ahead and experience them in a new way that lets us interact with those facts that we would otherwise not so viscerally experience.
And that's why, even though it's ugly, even though it's unpleasant, we can't forget this kind of stuff. Back when we were going through the big Confederate flag can't be anywhere, that doesn't mean you can get rid of the fact the Civil War happened. It happened. Just because Nazism is incredibly offensive on principle, you can't start removing swastikas. Because when you do that, then you start forgetting what made them reprehensible.
You have to contextualize history. You can't ignore it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we're about good on this one. Nick, thank you very much for coming on for this lighthearted and incredibly heavy topic.
You're welcome.
Let us know what games that you dropped because whatever reason. Let us know what games made you feel the sad feels and why. These are important. We need to talk about this kind of stuff.
On a closing note, rest in peace, Rustin Luther.
This is kind of what prompted this. One of a good friend of this show's, Urizen, their bassist, recently passed due to a stage 4 brain cancer. You will be missed terribly, and you will not be forgotten. On that note, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, I'm Josh, and this is Co-Opinions.